As I walk down by the seashore, this giant serpent rose up from the sea. He said, your nation is in danger of being destroyed by me. And I said, no, 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 no. The time to repent is passing, was the message that he had for me. Go and tell your neighbor, brother, that the word has come from me. And I said, no, no.
Hello there. Welcome to Presbycast. I was just scooning about the marina on my catamaran, listening to our intro music, about to make myself a refreshing spritzer on the deck for Mrs. Resby, as we just put the children below deck to sleep with the soothing sounds of the waves lapping against the sides of the yacht. But again, you're listening to Presbycast. We'll try to keep it down tonight so that we don't rock the boat too much and wake them. Welcome, everyone. As I said, thanks to everybody for listening around, doing so on demand, or if you're participating in the comments. As with all great comment sections, just remember, a good comment is its own reward. So, we'll try to post the good ones as they come through. And if you're just listening in your car or whatever have you, thank you anyways. Chortles, I'm going to throw it to you because I have a dog who's about to scratch my door down.
Well, I have an unruly dog in the room tonight as well, because we're having biblical rains here as a result of the remnants of Hurricane Ida. Now, I guess it's an Appalachian storm, Ida, not quite tropical. So the dog is restless, and you may hear from him. We've got someone new tonight. We've gone intersectional. Not our main guest, but a panelist member, Zoe. Some of you will remember her from the GA live show, and it's good to have you with us, Zoe. You're our youth delegate and our female voice. So how's that feel?
It feels very groundbreaking to be the voice and the face of intersectionality on the Presbycast. My parents always told me I had a face for podcasting, so.
Well, we don't agree with that, but try not to blow it, because there's a lot riding on you, on your appearance here tonight for the youth of America and the fairer sex. But our featured guest, a repeat guest, an authentically broken Presbyterian. He's out in the country. We can hear the cars going by. Maybe you'll hear all sorts of interesting sounds coming from the direction of the Reverend Ben Glazer. He of South Carolina and the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church. What's the name of your church there, and what's the name of that thriving metropolis that you inhabit?
Well, the name of our church is Bethany, and we are about 4 or 5 miles west of Clover, South Carolina, and enjoying the last few years of rural life before we get swallowed up by the monster to the northeast, Charlotte, North Carolina.
All right. Well, we hope you don't get swallowed up like the sea monster in that weird Christian yacht rock song that we opened with.
Well, Ben and I have done quite a bit of listening to weird rock and roll together. in the previous weeks. As I remarked on Twitter after the fact, I have seen both the ardor and the order of the good Reverend, and found it worthy. He was my accomplice to Dead and Company earlier this summer. I want to say, if you ever need someone to hand pick a poncho for you, Ben is your man. He decided at the Mart of Wall that he would get the $7 poncho instead of the $1 poncho. A decision which ultimately proved very fruitful.
And that made all the difference, like the road less taken.
Exactly.
That's right.
As the skies opened up forthwith and made their presence known.
All right. Well, we chose, I don't know, I don't think we're deluded, but we were talking, we think this is a show that only we could or would do. I'm sure with this innovative guest lineup that we have, that's unique and groundbreaking, as Zoe said. But it's about the weirdness of Presbyterianism and how that we should try to keep Presbyterianism weird. Some of our countercultural cities, Portland and Austin, they use the keep Austin weird, keep Portland weird, and I'm sure there's some kind of posers who are trying to do the same thing. But we've often made the point. Our friend Dan Borvin says that old school Presbyterianism is punk rock, not easy listening or adult contemporary or what have you. And there's Ben wearing his Ramones shirt. We don't know what sort of music that Zoe listens to, but it's probably not all Neil Diamond and Christopher Cross. And,
believe it or not, I listen to a lot of classic rock myself, and I'm really sad that I did not wear my Rolling Stones t-shirt tonight. I know my pastor is watching this stream, so my Pink Floyd t-shirt, I left it at home. I did not. I am at home.
Well, you may be too young to know. Those aren't punk or really alternative rock, but anyway, still,
it's close enough. It's the best.
It's fine. It's fine. That's we all have our issues. So the subject: keep Presbyterianism weird, and this was prompted. First, we wanted to do a show about an article that Ben wrote, and we're going to start with that. But it got me to thinking about the things that make Presbyterianism distinctive, i.e., weird. Those are the things that people take exception to. And at some point we'll ask, are some Presbyterians actually sort of ashamed or mildly embarrassed or just not altogether happy with the distinctives of Presbyterianism? So we'll talk about that as well. But I think a lot of people would say one of the weirdest things about the Westminster Standards would be the oft accepted or oft taken exception to portion of the larger catechism. Is that 109, Ben?
Yes, sir.
Question 109. Of course, the question's not controversial. It's the answer. That says that we shouldn't even make mental images of persons of the Trinity. And a lot of people don't get that. Maybe they don't want to get it. Maybe it's a genuinely challenging concept, but it's one of the weird things about our standards. First, Ben, let me ask you, this is unique to Westminster, is it not? I mean, we don't find that degree of restriction regarding images. Of course, 109 is about the second commandment, but we don't find that degree of there's Ranger the Presby dog chewing his chew toy behind me, so please ignore that. But we don't find anything like this in the other standards, do we?
Well, I mean, the Dutch certainly aren't in favor of making images of the Godhead, but their standards do not explicitly lay out mental images the way that the larger catechism does. Now, you'll find plenty of Second Reformation Dutch guys who agree with Presbyterians on mental images. For instance, I don't have the page number memorized, but Abrakel touches on this in A Christian's Reasonable Service. So it is in the water on the continent, but it's not marked out in the larger catechism the way it is in the larger catechism in Heidelberg or Second Helvetic or any of the other continental confessions.
Right. Although generally, I think the Second Helvetic, except for the mental image issue, is probably the strongest against images
Right.
of all the confessional documents.
Right. Which is somewhat ironic because a lot of times some of the guys who want to take exception, not just to this issue, but other weird Presbyterian stuff, like to pick up the Second Helvetic as if it's less rigorous as the Westminster Standards. But as you note, when it comes to the Second Commandment, is just as strong and bold as Westminster.
All right, so what prompted all this was an article you wrote, which you sort of meant as an introduction to the issue and an encouragement to read what Ralph Erskine, who's one of the, I guess, I know it's kind of complicated, but one of the founding fathers of the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, where you find yourself happily. Tell us about Erskine a bit before we talk about what he said. Yeah, I do have a look. We have him on screen here, and his hair is not very manly, but we'll overlook that.
There are better images of him on the Google machine, but one of my favorite Erskine quotes that I'm going to lead off with is what he had to say about his somewhat better known brother Ebenezer. He was jealous of Ebenezer because Ebenezer had died before him, and he said that his brother Ebenezer would beat him to Christ and to beat him to heaven. And one of the things I love about that is because, Ralph and Ebenezer, were, as you know, leaders of the seceding movement in the Church of Scotland, and they never felt like they had to one-up each other. They were very supportive of each other's ministries, and they sought to downplay their own importance in the movement. They were kind of scared in somewhat similar ways that John Calvin was of there being a cult of personality around them. But one of the things that led Ralph to write the book called Faith No Fancy was because there was great turmoil in the Associate Church over the itinerant ministry of George Whitefield. Now, most of our evangelical brothers will talk about Whitefield as this great and wonderful evangelist, and certainly he led many to Christ, but he destroyed a lot of churches, especially in Scotland. And so there was great concern about his lack of ecclesiastical concern in the land. And Erskine was dealing with a problem in his own congregation with men and women who had gone to a revival down in a part of Scotland that was called Cambusland. And there was a fellow down there by the name of James Rowe who was leading that revival and had invited Whitefield to come. Well, there were some people down there who claimed to see visions of Christ while they were engaged in this revival. And the popularity of the revival grew because people thought that if you went down there and got with Whitefield and with Robe, that you too could see Jesus physically. In your mind, he would be represented in your mind. And so this book is talking about the vain philosophy and vile divinity of a late pamphlet entitled Mr. Robe's Fourth Letter to Mr. Fisher, writing to James Fisher, one of the other founders of the seceding church. And his concern again is that this image that was being made was leading people away from the scriptural testimony of who Christ was. And that's one of the reasons why he titles this faith no fancy, because our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ is based on what has been revealed in special revelation, not what we conjure up in our own mental faculties. And his concern is that as people build up this false image of Christ, they will lose their faith in the true Christ. Much in the same way, it's said of those who led the early, search for the historical Jesus in the 19th century, that they looked into the well of history and saw their own reflection. Well, that's exactly what people do when they come up with false images. False images become you. You kind of identify yourself with Christ, and you lose again the picture of who Jesus really is. And so that's really the focus of why Erskine wrote this book. And it's important to recognize that this book is over 700 pages long. And there's nothing that Erskine deals with in that book that I've not heard brought up at a Presbyterian meeting, that some people think is a new idea of an image. One of the most popular ones that, of course, I'm sure all of us have probably heard at a Presbyterian meeting is that young children need to be educated about Christ. And children, of course, being visual learners, they need to have some representation of Christ. Well, the problem with that is that what's vain for an adult is vain for a child. We don't come up to some time period as we grow where we can do away with these mental images and just cleanse them out of our head. Of course, we all understand how our brains work. And once you get a picture of something, it's virtually impossible to rid yourself of that. And so that's the danger that Erskine is trying to warn his own congregation about. Another thing that we often hear is that the people of God, as they deal with these kind of things, is said, well, I have this image and it's impossible to cleanse my mind of it. Well, we wouldn't hold that standard, for instance, to the seventh commandment when it comes to when it comes to images of adultery. We wouldn't pass a man at Presbytery who said that that it was lawful to carry an image of a woman who was not his wife. We wouldn't hold to that. If a man brought that up, hopefully he would take direct care to be thrown out of the presbytery. And so there's no idea in the scriptures or in what Erskine writes that the second commandment is somehow separate from all the other commandments when it comes to mental images. And so, the concern Erskine has, again, going back to the title, is that we understand who Christ is based on special revelation and not on general revelation.
Let me break in. Now, is your son singing psalms or something else?
Matter of fact, he's singing out of the 1650 Scottish Psalter.
See, no one can criticize that. We can hear him. So,
okay. Actually, he was singing out of the ARP Bible Song book.
Okay. Well, just I said in the tweet about the show that you were an authentic Presbyterian, and it's just been proven. And I've got the. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I really like Ben's magisterial voice about the children and the Sunday school teacher that he did earlier. He kind of kicked into, it's the closest I've heard him to speaking Yankee since I've known him.
Well, there's going to be a fight now. So, Zoe, let me ask you a question as a young person, and you're not new to Presbyterianism. I think your parents are missionaries. You've been around. This idea of images, I mean, that comes up on the and I'm not asking you to reveal their views, but certainly it comes up on the mission field. And some people treat, the people in Africa or South America or well, I don't know, maybe parts of Illinois as no smarter than children, and they want to teach them with images. So, do images, the prohibition on images, even mental images, does that strike you as weird?
The prohibition on mental images definitely strikes me as weird, partially because I can't contrive any reason why you don't, it, why your conscious doesn't create something of an image for you. I couldn't relate what that image is. Um, the ban on mental images sounds weird because it doesn't seem like something you could stop yourself from doing. Maybe I'm not in tune with the Desert Fathers enough to know how to stop myself from thinking about something. The struggle with imagery in general is definitely something that you encounter a lot on the mission field. My parents are missionaries in Uganda, which is Central Eastern Africa. And a big part of their religious background is animism and idolatry. So we have a lot of students who come to us. A lot of them have children, and the same question comes up. My daughter, not my daughter, but a student's daughter, just wanted to clarify there. Um, my daughter has a son. My daughter has this image of God in her mind, and she says God is like a big man. And the student is being trained in classical reformed doctrine because the student is at the university at which my parents teach, which is a Bible university, teaches classically reformed doctrine. So the student says, I know we're not supposed to promote images of this, but this helps my child think about Christ in a way that makes sense to her. And that happens quite often. I don't know if I'd go so far as to think that that would be immoral, but definitely eyebrow raising as far as child rearing. I grew up with a picture Bible. I think someone gave us a picture Bible. It was nice. It was fun. The illustrations were good. They'd illustrate Christ in the picture Bible. I don't know if that's technically contrary to my to my doctrine, but I don't know. I don't think it hampered my efforts to become a real Presbyterian leader.
Well, we're glad you survived it, but the issue of kids is, I remember when I was still a Southern Baptist, as Ben probably knows, Halloween is a very uncomfortable time for evangelicals, or at least it used to be. And, they would have to have some sort of event around Halloween, and they would say that, costumes were okay, but they always hoped, well, we hope nobody dresses up as a serial killer. We hope they all come as, knights and damsels in distress and football players and animals. But inevitably, someone dresses in another way that's maybe inappropriate. But I remember a kid who once came with a wand and a blue cape, and he thought he was dressed as God. And even as a Baptist, that struck me as a really bad idea. So, Ben, let's address the issue of children and images.
Well, as I kind of alluded to earlier, there's a school of thought that children can only learn visually. That they need like it was noted, picture books and the like. And one of the things, of course, that we have to remember is that the Westminster Divines were aware of children, and they wrote the Shorter Catechism, for example, for children. They believed that children were capable of understanding biblical truths through verbal communication and describing, for example, the nature of the cross and the work of the gospel, doesn't need visual representation. Another thing that you hear a lot today is that, well, we live in a visual culture today. Everybody learns visually. We have the Facebook and we have the Instagram and we have the Snapchat and all that kind of stuff. And remember, what were medieval Roman Catholic cathedrals built to look like? They had images throughout the cathedral. And that's because, of course, most individuals were illiterate. And so if you go into a medieval cathedral, one of the things you'll see is the way that the stained glass will kind of give you a visual picture book all the way around of the history of the Bible, right? They'll show you all of these different, images to help the unlearned understand. Well, Calvin, in the Institutes, takes this head on and makes it clear that those images kept individuals in a state of childishness, that they kind of allowed people to stay in that kind of lower realm of understanding. Whereas, if you take a child and catechize them and help them understand these things, through the catechism, then the images become unnecessary. In fact, they actually become a hindrance. And that's something, again, that Erskine talks about in the midst of his work. One of the quotes that's in the the article I wrote, he says, if Mr. Robe think that these visible things that strike our senses can lead us to the quid fit, that is the perfect example of what God is, and that he must be clothed with such perfections, there would be little need of any other Bible than the visible heavens. In other words, at its logical endpoint, the argument for images basically does away with the need for special revelation. If visible representation is really all we need, then what do we need the scriptures for? We can go out and look at the sky, and we can look at the oceans and the mountains, and they all testify to the glory of God. And we can go, for instance, I'm sure you probably heard this growing up at a Baptist church about the dogwood tree. The way that the blossoms of the dogwood, give you an image of the cross, because there's a little red cross in the middle of the flower. And so, Erskine, again, in the book, is dealing with similar kind of arguments. And he says, again, to say that our senses and imaginations are greatly helpful to our knowledge of the divine nature and perfections, or to think upon the invisible things of God that are the objects of faith and not of sense, is in flat contradiction to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2:11-13, which says, for what man knows the things of a man except the spirit of the man which is in him? Even so, no one knows the things of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might know the things that have been freely given to us by God. These things we also speak, not in words which man's wisdom teaches, but which the Holy Spirit teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. So again, taken to its logical endpoint there, listen to what Paul says again. What the Holy Spirit teaches, comparing spiritual things with spiritual. Visual images of the Godhead necessarily present a false testimony to who God is. Because, first of all, obviously the Father and the Holy Spirit are not corporal beings, right? The Father and the Holy Spirit did not incarnate. So they don't have, a physical presence. So to image of the Father and the Son is to give to them something that they don't have, right? So it's adding to the Trinitarian nature. And obviously that's heresy. Obviously that's, beyond the pale. But when we come to the second person of the Trinity, and it's often brought up in this conversation, well, Jesus, became flesh, so it's okay to image him as a first century Jew. Well, again, the problem is that the scriptures wisely do not give us a picture of what Jesus looks like. We're not told how tall he is. We're not told, what his facial structure was, whether he had a beard or, was bald or whatever, right? We're not given that. And the reason for that is because the same reason that the elements of the old covenant were destroyed and allowed to disappear, because as Calvin says, our heart is an idol factory. And so if we were to do these particular things, what do? Again, we create this image in our own image, taking the physical and the physical rather than the spiritual and the spiritual, as we see there in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. So again, bringing this back to children, think again about how we are to raise our children up in the fear and admonition of the Lord. Well, one of the ways we do that is by teaching them the 10 Commandments. And the second commandment, as it's understood both in the shorter and larger catechisms, forbids both mental images and obviously physical images of the Godhead. And so if we don't introduce images, we're helping our children out by not giving them, again, this image that later on they're going to have to, through the work of sanctification and through the work of the Holy Spirit, kind of cleanse themselves from. Just like we don't allow our children to see images that violate any of the other commandments, right? And so this helps them as they grow in faith to have a right understanding of who Christ is and not a mixed testimony.
So it wouldn't be wrong to say to kids, obviously Jesus had a body just like we do, or he's got hands like you do. But, this may be silly, but I guess everyone tries to understand the Lord's Supper, which is really one of our approved images of Christ, the only ones. That baptism and the Lord's Supper, the sacraments are our approved images. But, when I'm holding the elements, I look at my hands and I think to myself sometimes, well, Christ had a wrist like I had. He was as real as my arms that I can clutch here. But I'm not making a mental image of his face or trying to, create a pathetic feeling as a result of looking into his eyes or caring whether he was, his skin was, two shades lighter or darker than my own. It also occurs to me that while, point you made earlier, how little information we have about Christ's appearance, it is interesting. Of course, there are other reasons this could have been true, but he may have been, the reason his disciples may not have recognized him after his resurrection may be that he was just that nondescript, even on a good day. Or maybe their minds were actually sort of clouded and cleansed, if you will, of some earlier, maybe more powerful images they had of him. I mean, I think that's possible. But, we know a lot more about what David looked like than what Christ looks like. And I think that should tell us something. The early Christians were capable of sketches, and as far as I know, they didn't even scratch a likeness on a cave where they might have been hiding. But we have presuppositions. We've always had images. We think so. We always will, and we always should. But it's not really so. And images were not ubiquitous at all periods of church history. So, what does the Book of Acts? What does it imply to you about mental images of Christ?
Well, I mean, Acts 17:29 is one of the scriptures that the larger catechism points to. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. That particular verse to me is a clincher, because when you think about, especially what Paul's dealing with in Acts 17 and the conversation that he's having with the wider culture there in that portion of the book of Acts, it's really weird to talk to the Greeks about a divine God that you don't image. It would have been just, mind-blowing to them. But his point is that, the God of the scriptures, the real God, is not like the gods that you have made with your hands. It's not like the God made by the man in the book of Isaiah as he's sitting by the fire, whittling, and he makes a god out of the wood and he puts it down and he bows to it. Right? That's not how our God is. Right? Our God is the eternal I am. He is not one who is made. He's not one who is created. He is the creator. And so to put him in a limited form, in gold, silver, or stone, or something shaped by art and man's devising, is to violate, the creator-creature distinction at its very basic. And so doing the same thing in our head, is really not any different than doing it with our hands. There's not a discontinuity there. And we're not allowed to do stuff in our head that we're not allowed to do with our hands.
Yeah, somewhere in the article, I think in one of the quotes from Erskine, he made the point that a mental image always precedes an actual image. And there's the dog again. Sorry.
I have an image in my head of what that dog is doing to that squeak toy.
With my wife and having already gone to bed, it's just me and the dog. So sorry. But I think and I'd like to hear Zoe's thoughts on this. The idea that a mental image will always precede a physical image, and to me that's a great common sense point that he makes, and that's implied in the Catechism, but it's not explicit. So I think that's helpful. So Zoe, does that help you any with the whole idea of the prohibition on even mental images in our standards?
I think it does help, also because I have here the Westminster Confession commentary by A. Hodge, and it says in the chapter about religious worship and the Sabbath day that divine worship is to be addressed equally to the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Part of making a mental image of Christ, because we have a physical description of him, not necessarily of his particulars, but Christ is the only member of the Trinity who was actually incarnate and physical. The idea that we only make a physical image after a mental one makes sense, partially because it calls to mind the scene of the Israelites making the golden calf after Moses goes up to talk to God. It could partially be because they were jealous. Moses gets to see God, and it could partially be they didn't just pull the idea, oh, let's make a golden calf out of thin air. They were already trying to conjure up in their minds what God looks like. And it sounds like an overly simplistic explanation, but actions are always precluded by thought, and the idea that we can enhance our understanding and relationship with Christ via images is a great temptation, especially when you consider the golden calf story and a lot of Catholic churches and architecture. Even though they're beautiful, they might be distracting from the ultimate goal. You might be less inclined to worship the three members of the Trinity if you have a mental image of one of them in your mind.
Yeah, and Christ being the God-man, we can only, of course, they're always imperfect, and they always lie because we don't know. I tell people, I often use the image of, there was always some guy in school who said he had a girlfriend at another school, and, he would maybe get a fake picture, or he would get he'd buy a wallet that would have a picture of a girl in that, and that would be his girlfriend, he would say.
You have to add 2 grades onto it too. So she's a junior at another school.
Yeah.
Well, which school she went to. She went to Bishop Sycamore.
Okay. I'll take your word for it. But that's one thing, to misrepresent, an imaginary person. But if any image ever has to be perfect to do justice to the person imaged, it would be that of Christ. But we could only imagine what his body looked like, and no picture can represent his divinity. He was the God-man. So it's a lying image because, I guess the Roman Catholics would try to deal with this by putting a halo around Christ, or a painter might paint him lighter or more radiant than the other people in the painting. But you can't; the images just can't do justice. And if the physical images can't, neither can our mental images. So, do you think, Ben, it's the emotionalism, the sentimentalism? I mean, a lot of the terrible pictures, of course, they're all terrible, but a lot of the terrible images of Jesus we see came from the Victorian era. Lily white feet, very delicate features, long but thin hair, Jesus. So, do emotionalism, sentimentalism, and images go together? I think.
No, absolutely. That's whenever I see a picture purporting to be Jesus, I always tell my kids that that person must be a huge fan of Dan Fogelberg. But the reality is that so much of what we understand about images, especially in our context, the Roman Catholics are going to do what the Roman Catholics do, and the Lutherans are going to do what the Lutherans do, and the Methodists are going to Methodists going to do. And on one hand, I'm not as concerned about them. There's bigger fish to fry with them than images. But in the Presbyterian world, you really start seeing them pop up in the Victorian era because there's just this general thing in the air in that period where everybody is just kind of tied into this very superficial understanding of religious faith. And one of the things about superficial faith is that it looks for the easy and it looks for the simple. And so the easiest way to show your neighbor that you are religious is to have a picture of Dan Fogelberg up on your mantle. The easiest way to show your neighbor that you're a Christian is to have a huge Bible up on your coffee table. And so that's part of it in my mind, in my estimation. And that's one of the reasons why you start seeing, and this is going to be kind of in left field here, but it's one of the reasons why you start seeing the Lord's Supper show up at Presbyterian meetings in the early 20th century. I mean, that was totally foreign to Presbyterians prior to the late 19th, early 20th century, is because it seems religious to do. And so the more of the outward forms that you can get a hold of, the more you seem religious. And the easy part of religion is the quote unquote outward forms. And so that's one of the reasons in my mind why they started becoming so popular. Now, another thing, and I see Phil mentioned this in the comments, and he must be reading my mind, but I was getting ready to mention, the Nestorian stuff about the way that pictures of Christ operate, right? Mental images, especially, necessarily divide the two natures of Christ, because we cannot image the divinity of Jesus, the Son of God. Now, one of the reasons why that plays into the whole picture and the sentimentality part of it is because it lowers the value of who Christ is by making him into a Norwegian fisherman, or making him into any color whatsoever. Now, one other thing we think about here is the proper image that we have of Christ. And the proper visible image that we have to represent our Lord and Savior is the table, is the supper, is the bread and the wine. Now, we don't worship the bread and the wine. We don't lift them up as if they are Christ, but they are the only visible representations we're given to use, not to worship, not to, again, make somewhat holy in the sense of giving them a power that they don't have. But it also, again, the images dilute the power of the visible representation that we have at the table. And so all of this stuff, again, is because it all goes back to this idea that you brought up about the Victorian age and the kind of fake nostalgia that was popular in the Victorian age, because we get all the representations of who Santa Claus is out of the Victorian age, right? And what does Santa Claus look like? He's a
Well,
big
I
bearded
prefer
white
I
man.
prefer I watch The Office, so I prefer Belschnickel. He's like Santa, only scarier and dirtier, I think they said.
Santa looks like Jerry Garcia.
That's right.
So we have a lot to. I mean, was the Victorian era sort of romanticism gone to seed? I mean, is that kind of is it sort of what that was?
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember the name of it right now off the top of my head, but there's an excellent book out there that uh, shows again how almost all of the things that we think are traditional were completely made up out of whole cloth by the Victorians. Not just Santa Claus, but our understanding of Halloween, our understanding of all kinds of holidays that are sacrosanct today were just cobbled together in the Victorian age, and that it all goes back in my mind to romanticism, right? This creation of a false history.
Yeah, and somebody mentioned in the comments you were talking about Dan Fogelberg earlier as the model for Jesus, but most of our listeners are too young for that. So just think about Ewan McGregor's Obi-Wan Kenobi, and of course there was an internet meme that went around a few years ago, and this was probably true. Some Roman Catholic guy said that his grandmother had an image of Obi-Wan in his robe on the mantle, and she thought it was Jesus, and she was very proud of it. So we can get it wrong. Now, other people have made the point. Our friend Lennox in the comments, and I've made this point arguing with progressives who, many, let's just say the missionals in the PCA. They almost all take exception to these passages. They believe in the pedagogical use, and they certainly think mental images are fine because what could they hurt? How could you help it? And but if you're concerned about racism and white supremacy, even, which is the buzzword of the day, I can see why you should have a problem with mental and actual, painted or graven or whatever images of Christ, because they're bound to lie. And we know we're pretty sure that the ones showing him looking like, any of the people we've mentioned are wrong. But equally, if you go to Korea and you find a Korean-looking Jesus, or in Africa, a black Jesus could be right, may not be. I mean, it may be right, may be wrong. But again, we don't roll the dice with images, an image of a person of the Trinity. So, what do you think about the whole? I mean, I'm sure images of white Jesus were weaponized against at some time in the past, but I think also making an image of Jesus in whatever you think is the best looking type of human, that equally could be dangerous and harmful and weaponized.
Oh, that for me. The problem, with all of that is that if we all create a Jesus in our own image, we're not then all worshiping the same Jesus. We're in a day and age where everybody is trying to kind of create their own reality, and there's a lot of anger against the any attempt to lay out a an understanding of something that is for everyone. Everybody has a little niche thing that they do, and images plays into that. So everybody can kind of make that Jesus that makes them comfortable, and that Jesus that helps them in whatever particular situation that they're in. And again, to go back to Ralph, he makes it clear that that's one of the dangers of images, is that images cause us to miss the big picture of who Jesus is. And images domesticate who Jesus is, changes who Jesus is. And any of that destroys, again, true faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. I see you scrolling to probably my favorite quote, mainly because he talks about dung hills. But to seek after any part of the knowledge of Christ, our own imaginary idea of him as a man, is equally as foolish as seek the morning star in a dungeon or the sun in a dunghill. Right? Images blind us to the real Jesus. And so any attempt to do that is destructive to Christian unity, if anything else.
Doctrine of God issues are hard. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Ultimately, I mean, it's when we're talking about images. I mean, when the the Ten Commandments were given, they were talking about images of the one true God, and the Trinity was not understood then. So that's not just Christology here. It's a doctrine of God issue, and it's a worship issue. And I mean, the second commandment, you can't be separated from the first. It just can't be. But another thing is that Christology is also hard to teach. If you try to teach Christology in the Athanasian Creed to a youth class, that's hard work. It's much easier to show them a picture, but to form not mental images, but proper biblical concepts of who Christ is and who God the Father is, and certainly who the Spirit is and what the Spirit does. That's all hard work, and I think we understand why people seek shortcuts, but I think we also understand why they shouldn't. So images are a human.
Images are bad. I'm kind.
It's a human thing, but there are many human things we ought to avoid. All right. Well, so is there anything else about images specifically in the article that we ought to touch on, or anything before we move on to broader topics?
Well, earlier Zoe had brought up the calf and Aaron, and in fact, the last quote that I shared in that piece touches on that. Erskine says, "They bring forth an image of Christ formed in the brain by an imaginary idea. As Aaron said of the idol, I cast the gold into the fire, and there came out this calf. They bring forth an image of Christ that diverts the mind from the true Christ and from the true spiritual object of faith set before us in the gospel, where alone we see Christ." And he cites 2 Corinthians 3:18 to back up. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that these images keep us from seeing Christ as he truly is and as he's set before us in the gospel. Anything that mixes the creation with the creator is bad news.
Yeah, so as we teach about Christ, I mean, of course, just reading the scripture is important, but we hope people have an experience of Christ. We hope people have faith that's alive and real. But there are factual things about what Christ did and who the Bible says he is. I mean, that's what's really important. I mean, the gospel is good news. It's announcement of something that's been done, first of all. And that's what we should, I think, as hard as it is, that's what we should spend our time trying to do properly, is set forth what Christ has done, not what he might have looked like. But again, it's all hard work. It's all essential work. And anyone who tried to communicate, I mean, the work of a mother in the home trying to teach some of these truths to children it's hard work. It's important work, but we ought to. It's up to pastors to teach and elders to teach and encourage, and for all Christians to apply themselves to knowing these truths in a way that they can communicate them according to their station and according to who it's not everyone's job to communicate these things to everyone, but where that's the case, we need to have the facts and the truths of Scripture. So, and you don't get that. You don't get that in every church. You just don't get it. And there, St. Ranger, the Presby dog, agrees, and he knows it's all very, very important, he says. All right. So, anything else on images before we pass on to other things?
I was just thinking that mental images are to worship, sort of the equivalent of revivalism to worship. You replace highly doctrinally specific, scripturally rich institutions with emotive nonsense. Hans Feeney of Lutheran Satire does great videos about how worship music has been sort of Christian contemporary music has sort of been hit with the sledgehammer of emotive marketing, where you have people singing as if they're singing to a boyfriend, but you just replace the boyfriend's name with Jesus.
Now, what do you know about boyfriends?
Nothing.
Zoe?
Nothing.
Good.
All, actually,
keep it that way.
I have like about 60 REs and TEs who I believe would probably take a bullet for me. I'm not in a boastful way. I love all of you, and I would never get a boyfriend without telling you.
Okay, well that's all good. So you're this person that I met, and then 4 hours later we had you on the podcast. So that was a record. So we do think the world of you. So all right. So this is one of the weird things about being Presbyterian, and one of those things that might be hard to explain to people. People walking into the average, well, maybe not the average, but what we would call, Ben, a proper Presbyterian church building, they're going to notice the lack of some things. So, first of all, tell me, and I've been to your church building very early one morning. Tell us, if someone walks into a proper Presbyterian church building, what are they not going to see?
Is this a Lord's Day where the bass boat is or is not parked out in front of Ben's church?
Well, I got the story on that. Ben's been a good neighbor, and he lets this teacher park the bass boat there so he can get to the lake quickly after school. So, continue, Ben.
We know you. No jury would convict.
Oh, you're mute. Let me unmute you, Ben. Sorry, I was trying to cut some noise out there. Okay, go, Ben.
I think I've shared with you before that the local sheriff's department likes to use our facilities to prepare for interdiction work in our area. And so there's a good chance you might see sheriff's deputies outside our church on a Lord's Day morning. But normally on a Lord's Day morning, what you're going to see, and when you walk into our sanctuary, or what you're not going to see, is you're not going to see a big cross anywhere. You're not gonna see a either a stylized cross or a cross at all. You're going to walk in the front door of the church, and you're going to look down, you're going to see the pulpit, you're going to see the baptismal, and that's pretty much it. There is not going to be
and
a
a
whole
table.
lot of,
There's going to be a table.
and a table. Yeah, there's a table down there. And right now we're using it to put the tripod on to record services.
Oh, that's sacrilege, Bill. Ben, you can't do that. It's a holy table.
We were somewhat concerned about that, but we discovered that people were more interested in being able to live stream than they were about the furniture, which was a good thing to hear.
We were working on something or moving some stuff around, and somebody set something down on the table, or they almost did. And they said, "Oh, well, can I put this there?" And I said, "Well, if it's not the first Sunday of the month, and there's nothing on it, it's just a table." So we've actually, of course, I shouldn't reveal this. It actually doesn't matter, but we've got one of those communion tables that says "In remembrance of me,"
Ours does as well.
Which is the kind of the it sort of can be construed as the memorialist view, and since most churches that bought those communion tables were either Baptist and they didn't care, or maybe Methodist or somebody and they didn't have any idea what they believed, probably. That "In remembrance of me," I've always thought if you're going to have one Bible verse posted in your church, maybe that's not the one you should have. So in practical terms, sometimes our table gets turned around backwards where you can't read that. But but the PCA BCO, this is a weirdness of the PCA BCO. It says the table must be decently covered. In other words, we're told that there has to be a cloth on the table. So when you put the cloth on it, you can't read that anyway. But I'll just say in our church, we sometimes leave it turned around backwards, so you can't see it.
Well, there's some irony there if you want to get into some other weird Presbyterian things. And of course, this isn't unique to Presbyterians, at least it didn't used to be. But it's ironic that the BCO requires the table to be covered, but does not say anything about women being covered in the worship service. But
they all wear. All your women wear clothes, and
that's right. Yes.
And when Zoe was floor clerking at the General Assembly, she was decently covered. So I'm feeling okay about that. That's sort of a natural law thing, I think.
Yes, sir.
When I was younger, I asked questions about why we didn't have head coverings because we were told to emote as reverent of worship as possible, and we knew that some people still did that. And the way my parents explained it to me was that we were supposed to draw as little attention to ourselves as possible. So in this cultural atmosphere, head coverings would draw undue attention to us. Maybe we'd be confused with Mennonites. Not necessarily that that'd be the worst thing in the world, right? I'm beginning to have more and more respect for them as time goes by. Nor were we allowed to dress immodestly. So it's sort of a pendulum approach, because the function was women are to draw undue attention to themselves, as we females are wont to do.
Oh, I've never seen that happen. So
no, I don't know who these females are that want all this attention, but I want nothing to do with them.
All right, Ben. So you brought up a good point. In fact, we have a really nice church building, but it's very simple. And you even mentioned something controversial, the fact that some church buildings don't even have crosses, and that really rubs some people the wrong way. And we don't think it's an image of Christ on the order of a painting, but it is a symbol. Many years ago, I was a member of a PCUSA church a long time ago, and they had a showy gold cross with the IHS letters in the middle. Somebody paid a lot of money for it. Somebody donated thousands of dollars for it, and it became a focal point. If you just had to. And the question is whether whether a symbol like that is appropriate, and especially if it draws your attention. Our church building happens to have only incidental crosses, where door frames, and we've got a kind of a rose window that's just got a simple vertical and horizontal line. So really, if somebody said you don't have any crosses, we could point to that, but they are truly incidental and accidental, you might even say. But I don't think we wouldn't consider crosses on the same level as images of persons, but it's something to think about. So that's another weirdness, something you have to explain. If you have a steeple with no cross on top, or if you have a large building face with no cross on it, some people are going to be offended at that. It's hard to explain that, but maybe it's worth doing so, worth the effort. But you also have to know why it's that way. You have to be able to explain it, and some of us can't do that. So those are some visual things that are weird. But there are other things that are weird about our piety, and a lot of those have to do with another section of our standards that many people take exception to, probably maybe even in the ARP, in the PCA, and maybe at least in a de facto sense in other denominations, and that would be the teachings regarding the Lord's Day. Or the Christian Sabbath, if you will, what should and shouldn't be done then. And I don't think anything sets off old school confessional Presbyterians more in the 21st century than our doctrine of the Lord's Day. So do you think that's one of the oddities of our piety?
Well, I wrote an article about 6 months ago where I kind of poked fun at the fact that this is now an oddity in the Presbyterian Church, because the Sabbath used to be one of those things that every Protestant, every Roman Catholic understood that the Lord's Day was special, that it was not a day for commercial activity. It was not a day for sporting events. It was a day of rest. And to kind of poke fun of it, I brought up a booklet that I have by Oral Roberts, written in the late 1940s, where he advocates for Sabbath keeping and marks out Sabbath keeping as one of the signs of holy living. Now, the idea that somebody like Oral Roberts today in his world would think of the Sabbath in that way would just be bonkers. But we're about the only people left who still hold to the uniqueness of the Sabbath day in again, basic Christian holiness. And of course, one of the exceptions that always gets brought up at Presbytery, and I'm sure you hear this every time, is the so-called recreation clause in Westminster Confession of Faith 21. And what I always find out when I ask questions about this is that there is great misunderstanding, mostly from a lack of curiosity as to what the divines understood by recreation. And if you do any kind of cursory reading on the understanding of the Westminster Divines on that, it all goes back, of course, to James and the Book of Sports and the requirements that were placed down upon
King James.
Yes, King James.
Yes.
And now King Jimmy's my buddy for other reasons, but he was definitely not my buddy when it comes to the Book of Sports. Now, the Divines and their the 12th volume of the Confessional Presbyterian Journal, which I highly recommend picking up, is devoted totally to the Sabbath. And there is an excellent article in here, one by Ryan McGraw and another by Lane Keister, that talk about what the recreation clause actually means. It does not mean that it's unlawful for you to go and throw a ball with your child in the backyard to burn steam after a hard day's work, or in order to burn off steam so that you can go to the second service on the Lord's Day. The recreation clause does not ban you from letting your kids run around in the yard. That has nothing to do with that. The recreation clause is all about this idea that we are to engage in activities on the Sabbath that encourage us to worship, that encourage us to prepare ourselves for both the first and second service on the Lord's Day, and to spend time contemplating the beauties of what heaven is going to be like. That's one of the reasons why we speak of the Sabbath as a foretaste of heaven. Now, to back up a second, one of the issues that makes Sabbath keeping so hard today, and this is another, weird thing, is that we see a total lack of evening services today in the Presbyterian Church and in the evangelical church in general. And so it makes it even more difficult to keep the Sabbath when you don't have that second service to prepare for. If you're done, so to speak, at 12:15, 12:30, 1 o'clock, and then you have 7 hours until your kids go to bed, well, it's going to be more difficult to keep the Sabbath holy. But if you have that second service, and also if your church is organizing activities to encourage Sabbath keeping, then it's going to be much less of a burden on you. And so that's part of the reason why I think that pops up nowadays, is just there's a total lack of understanding of the importance, not just second service, but of the whole day of Sabbath keeping, and the way that Sabbath keeping is actually not just a first table, but a second table ordinance. It's a love of neighbor work. The great irony, of course, of a lot of people wanting to get out early to go eat at the local Mexican restaurant, and then talking to their server about whether or not they go to church. Well, it's hard for your server to go to church if she's had to be at the Mexican restaurant getting ready for you to come eat there.
I always say that that guy who cuts the prime rib at the Sizzler buffet, he's probably the most witnessed to guy in the country, wouldn't you think? I mean, every Baptist going to go down the line, and surely they're going to tell him about what a good service they had, since they appreciate that good work he's doing for them. And we should say Presbyterianism is weird, but it's not really legalistic in this way. I mean,
No.
Some Presbyterians we don't have the rules that the Israelites had. Some people sort of think, well, okay, I'm going to, in the interest of preparing for worship, when the sun goes down, Saturday night, that's sort of when the Sabbath begins. And when we get home from church on Sunday night, we sort of hit the reset button. Some people, it might be, dawn to dusk on Sunday. It's going to be a lot more flexible for some people, but you probably are going to have a hard time finding someone who's been disciplined by their elders for doing just one little wrong thing on Sunday. There's a lot of latitude given, even in the most conservative churches, in this way. And it's sort of, I think we sort of treat it like we ought to treat the vaccine. We don't ask we don't ask exactly what you've been doing or what what's going on. Did you turn the TV on for 20 minutes, or did you watch the football game? Nobody's going to ask you that. But I think you're going to find that, especially if you have two services, you're going to find those who are most concerned about the Sabbath are probably going to be at that second service. It becomes fairly fairly obvious, how much regard people have for it. But another use of the Lord's Day, we shouldn't overlook it, is actually physical rest. As you get older, and you appreciate the importance of rest a lot more than when you're young, like Zoe. I found, since we heard earlier tonight from Ranger the Presby dog, he knows when it's Sunday. He absolutely picks up on our different routine, and he does not ask to do things. He does not require as much from us on Sunday. When we get ready to go to church, he can tell we're about to go, and he goes and gets in his crate, or he goes and he just knows it's different. He's figured it out. So that implies to me, your kids could figure that out. I mean, they can get used to Sunday if a dog can. So it's okay to be different on Sunday. And I think it's a powerful witness because when people ask you on Monday, what did you do over the weekend? And you can tell them what you did, and they might wonder why. And that might sound a little different. And, practically speaking, you're going to have to turn down some things. There's things you are going to do and not do, and see and not see on Sunday that may set you apart. Now, I do remember he's no longer a minister of any kind, but he's certainly no longer a PCA minister. But there was a famous Presbyterian minister with a famous Baptist relative, and I don't know what exceptions he took to the larger catechism on the Lord's Day, but he would go from his service straight to the airport down there in Fort Lauderdale or Miami, and fly to an NFL game with his son. And he would often tweet pictures of himself doing so. So whatever exceptions he took, he displayed his exceptions. Very, very interesting. Also know of a very famous Southern Baptist pastor, one that everyone would know. I know a minister who used to work at that church, and he said that Brother so-and-so would park right by the back door. As soon as the service was over, without talking to anyone, he would make a beeline to his car, and before most people got out of the church parking lot, or maybe even out the back front door, he and his wife were at their favorite Mexican restaurant. So there you go. He needed the rest, apparently, and what better place to rest than Casa Lupita, or whatever it's called. So strange. We should remember that the Southern Baptists sort of they had a doctrine of the Lord's Day until they came up with the 2000 Baptist Faith and Message, which pretty much says, do what you want to do. And I was still a Baptist when that came out, and I think I had a problem with it even then, though maybe I didn't know why.
As long as you feel vaguely spiritual about what you're doing, the action is justified. You can feel spiritual about the Sunday football game. You just have to emote properly.
Well, you can certainly have a charismatic experience watching a football game. Many can. It can also be remarkably ascetic.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, as a fan of an alumnus of the University of Pittsburgh, the Saturdays are more like the Desert Fathers experience for me. There's a lot of self-flagellation and a lot of need to walk long miles after because of need to work off anger and the like.
This is the advantage of going to a school that was in the Pacific time zone, is that many times the game may not kick off until 10:30, possibly even 11. Currently. So for basketball season, maybe I can swing it once a week, but for football, it's unlikely that I'm going to stay up until 2 a.m. To watch a very potential loss. Or worse, a 3-quarter domination only to lose by a field goal.
All right, so when we talk about the weirdness of Presbyterianism and some of the oddities, and I'm doing that in air quotes because it's not really odd, although we hear about the foolishness of preaching. So we should we shouldn't be surprised that many of the things we do seem foolish or odd. But some of the things that people think are weird about what we do, it may be that they're just otherworldly, that they actually point to another world, and that they're eschatological. They point to what is to come. So I don't think we should. I don't think we should apologize for being otherworldly. And I think most of our neighbors and even most of our religious friends, maybe the other world is not it's foreign to them. It's a foreign concept. So Ben, what do you think about that? I mean, we want to be so accessible and user friendly and consumer friendly that are we? And it's kind of what we'll wrap up on. Have we lost our nerve? Are we ashamed of our oddity? Have we lost faith in the means of grace, which are simple and non-visual, typically? I mean, non-visual in the way that a movie or a picture book is. Have we simply lost faith? And of course, I mean, it's really, have we lost faith in the work of the Spirit and the power of the Word, read and preached and sung? We haven't even talked about Psalms.
Well, yeah, that's another unique thing about us is we sing mostly Psalms at Bethany, but yeah, one of the things that my good buddy Miles Smith and I agree on is that good fences make good neighbors. And as Presbyterians, we should be as full bore, 100% geared towards being a Presbyterian as we can be. And that helps our witness for the gospel, because people can smell not just fakeness, but they can smell that you're not really serious about this quite easily. And so the more honest and the more glad we are to be distinctive, the more attractive we'll actually be. Especially, I say this as an old man, old 41-year-old man, but the young people today are seeking.
It's true. Ben doesn't look a day over 52.
The young people today are seeking authenticity, right? They're seeking people who are comfortable in their own skin, who understand who they are. And we are Presbyterians. And we better be Presbyterians, because if we try to be anything else, we're not going to be any good at it, because that ain't who we are. And so we need to embrace our weirdness and just love it all the time, because that's who we are. And of course, this is going to sound crazy, but we believe this stuff because that's what we think the Bible teaches, right? We're not just weird for weird's sake, right? We're not just holding to the confession because we're traditionalists, right? We believe that the Sabbath day is become holy because that's what Isaiah 58 says, right? That's what we believe. The example of, John, the end of John's gospel, of Hebrews 4, right? We believe that mental images are not acceptable because of what the scriptures teach. And we need, again, to be confident in that. And we don't need to be embarrassed by it, because why would you be embarrassed by holding to the scriptures?
You bring up a good point, because and that was exactly one of the things that attracted us to our current church. Is we know, and you notice it almost immediately when you go into a church where the people believe what they actually say they do, are comfortable in it, and want to inquire as to how much you agree with them in sort of, I guess that's sort of the best way to put it. But like the comfort level, or just the like you actually believe that? Yeah. And like, there's sort of, it almost sounds like it's not nonchalant. It's not even cynicism. It's a comfort level. But on the flip side of that, I think that's something that really drives it home is I think about previous church experiences where maybe it wasn't, me or, me and my wife feeling out of place, but it was just that we were so much comfortable with what the weight and meaning of our beliefs meant than a lot of other people there, or there were those still kind of searching for, that level of comfort and anchor in it. And I think that is something, and I'm not saying that search or that, that lack of comfort is necessarily a bad thing. I'm grateful for it in my life insofar as it got me here, and to where I am comfortable with it. But it is one of those things where you notice both sides of it very quickly as you go through it.
Zoe, can you since you're the representative of all the American youth here, what Ben says about young people having I guess what you might call a sensitive BS detector and a longing for things that are authentic. Is he right about that?
I don't know. I'm struggling to come to terms with that statement because I want to believe that it's true, especially about myself, partially because I'm, dyed in the wool, as it were. I think that there are two types of youth, of young person. The first type is the type that Ben talked about, the one that's looking for authenticity and whose BS detector is on point. And the second one is the youth who is being told constantly by the culture and falling for it that you need to seek out what makes you most comfortable, and whatever makes you most comfortable is automatically inherently right.
So you're describing youth group at this point.
I am describing youth group, and thank you for bringing that up because that is what I wanted to talk about. Churches on the face of the church may not be ashamed to be Presbyterian, but as a missionary kid, I have been to slews of youth groups, and these churches who are at face value unashamed to be Presbyterian do not teach their kids, and by kids I mean people who are in their late teens, how to be Presbyterian. It's vague, messagey gospel. And sure, maybe we'll talk about Romans 9, but not for very long, and then it's coffee time. So there is not in all churches, of course, hashtag not all, but there is definitely in some areas a distinction between assuming a Presbyterian vibe or facade, and not necessarily that those churches are not truly Presbyterian churches, but it seems like they're ashamed to pass on their Presbyterianism, their uniqueness, their individuality down to people in the youth groups. And I think this milquetoast youth group thing, I call it the milquetoast youth group to atheist pipeline, because if we don't embrace our uniqueness and what makes our denomination as we see it to be correct, we will never draw in our children, and we will never actually communicate the gravity of our beliefs to them if we have these dumb milquetoast. I keep saying milquetoast because I've been to a lot of youth groups, and that's pretty much the only way to describe them. If that is all we have to offer our youth, I'm not confused about why they don't want to embrace Presbyterianism just like the rest of us in this chat and on this server.
Amen.
Well, yeah, and it's also like what did Ben say earlier? Like, there's a curiosity that needs to be present, and it's not just in the faith tradition. I mean, I think you can apply that out even to I guess sort of like a pride in where your family comes from, previous generations. I've never been more proud to be of Polish descent. I'm very grateful for the anti-Nazi and anti-communism in my very recent family history, as
You're
well as
still a
some boot,
wasp, Presby.
as well as some bootlegging, even in the mitten. But as far as like, but that wasn't always there. Like there was, I can remember a time where I felt sort of, I probably milk toast is just a perfect word for it.
I like toast a whole lot, though. Let me leave that there.
Oh, I'm a toast guy. Okay, so let me like capital T toast guy. Like we respect toast, but at the same time, like until you actually, it's sort of like you have something has to spark the desire to learn more, and then once you learn more, you're typically glad that you did, or it gives you a better understanding, which allows you to take, a greater pride in what that is. And I think, and I don't know that there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, but your point about sort of the like youth group to atheist pipeline. I mean, I don't have enough fingers to count the number of friends who went through very similar things, or who people who we lived in the same house in college because of a shared faith, who are certainly not there now. And certainly, non-denominationalism has some sort of effect. Whatever the emergent church was for however long, I'm sure had some sort of effect. Let alone, all the stuff you see and are introduced to in college and stuff like that. But the curiosity, I think, is a real linchpin there. Is once you have a desire to learn and you do learn, it gives you a greater confidence in what you believe.
Now, as we're talking about, what we're talking about
Someone
here.
should do a podcast, what you believe, and know what you believe and why you believe it.
Yeah, I don't
Got a real
think
catchy tagline.
I don't think we're up to that. But we're talking about apostasy here, and when we talk about that, we have to remember election is still a thing. Perfectly raised, catechized homeschoolers become serial killers, and serial killers become Christians. And but we know what we're supposed to do. We try to do the right thing, fulfill our responsibilities, and be biblical, even knowing that none of those things are automatic, and we can't we can't predict, we can't control. I mean, our knowledge our knowledge of total depravity tells us that it takes supernatural assistance at every point, but we're also given promises, covenant promises, biblical promises that tell us what we ought to do and what we can reasonably expect if we do those things, and if we do them in faith. So, we it's okay to be weird. That's one of our messages tonight, and I think we can display that. If any Reformed podcast can display weirdness, and maybe not the value of it, but the prevalence of it, maybe it's us. So, Zoe, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your contributions. And it was a thrill to meet you at General Assembly. And Ben, thanks for your good words. I suppose you would direct people. You would direct people to that Erskine book, Faith No Fancy. It is available on archive.org. I was going to put it on screen, but everyone can find it. And if you were reading that book and someone said, "What are you reading?" Probably even people at church would think you were weird for reading a 700-page, what is it, 300-year-old book about mental images of Christ. But it might imply that you take Christ seriously, and that's good. So, anything either one of you want to say before Resby says the most important thing in any Presbycast, which is good night?
Wow, spoiler.
Only
Well-
that it's actually I've actually only that women who think that they're going to be not sought after because they're confessional and proud of it. There are plenty of people in my DMs on Twitter all the time who are like, "Hey, you seem serious.
Oh no!
You
Oh
seem
no!
serious about your faith. I'm Catholic. Please let's date." This has happened to me within last week. You seem like a girl who's serious about what she believes, and I want that, but also I'm Catholic. So,
Oh boy! Yeah,
not
I'm
exactly
sorry.
the right kind of guys, but I'm sort of landing in the ballpark. I don't know.
Oh boy!
It's not my goal to use my Twitter to get a husband, but I could if I wanted to.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. Probably a prince from another continent probably could even be had.
I've met princes from other continents. That is not necessarily a poll, but you never know.
All right, so everyone pray for Zoe and her DMs and her wisdom and how she receives them. No, she was raised well. So Ben,
I don't know exactly how to follow that up, but
here's the follow up. Without revealing names, can we read them on an episode of Presbycast?
Yes, please do. I would love to provide you guys with the DMs.
Okay.
I've actually,
wow.
I'm actually still ongoing a vitriolic discussion with a Catholic friend of mine who wants to date me, but I pulled up the Catholic Catechism, which is what I have sitting behind me back there, to debate him about whether or not he should be interested in me as a Protestant. And he's like, well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And I'm like, well, it says it's a sin for you not to baptize your children into the Catholic Church. And it's also a sin for you to approach me without telling me this as a possibility, because every relationship is going somewhere. So yes, I would be happy to provide that.
Oh, this is great.
we'll do a future social media show.
And there's nothing better than having them read in that digitized, automated, like bot voice as well. So if we're not looking, yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess one follow up to that is that, hey, all you Presbyterian young men and young women, marry Presbyterians and do so because that's what the confession says you should do.
Marry as if Western civilization depended on it, because it does.
That's right. Because remember, it's a great sin to neglect baptism of covenant children. Now, I totally forget what I was going to close on. You mentioned reading books like Faith No Fancy and that kind of stuff. Well, my good buddy Clint Davis likes to give me a hard time that if a book is currently in print, I will not read it. I am eternally grateful to the poor, underpaid interns at the University of Princeton, or Princeton University, who digitized the entire Puritan library that Princeton Theological Seminary has, and has given to us a diamond mine full of wonderful Puritan works. And it's an example of common grace. But again, thanks again for having me on, and what a long, strange trip it's been.
We'll say hello to the family, and we might even see them in a few weeks. Hope that happens. And Resby, I think it's all about you now.
Oh, see, I can't even like milk a toast like youth group. I can immediately kick into like what CCM song you just set me up for, and I almost sang it. I almost did. But thank you to everyone for listening. Thank you everyone for watching, contributing. I actually have two things to leave you with, very similarly worded. The first is don't be a reply guy, and two, don't be an Erdman.
He said your nation is in danger of being destroyed by me. And I said, no, no, no. The time to repent is passing, was the message that he had for me. Go and tell your neighbor, brother, that the word has come from me. And I said, no. As he turned in the water so slightly, his name on his back I could read. It read greed, lust, and self-destruction, along with war, pride, and vanity. And I pleaded no.
Magic on the internet worldwide.